Everybody who's joined us to the live online monthly event of the JFK Peace Speech Committee. In a few moments, we'll be hearing from our guest speaker, Dennis Kucinich, and after that, we'll be taking question and answers. Let's see. I would like to say that it is my honor to introduce Congressman Dennis Kucinich, former mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, former US Congressman from Ohio, and a two-time US presidential candidate. Personally, I first heard Dennis speaking out against the impending invasion of Iraq in 2003, and I was a Washington state delegate for Kucinich for president in 2004. And I was asked by Marty Schatz to sing this little song that I wrote in 2004 for Dennis. I know I'll embarrass him, and I apologize for that in advance. And it goes like this. Dennis the Menace came to the Capitol and he just won't behave. He got Mr. Bush, Mr. Cheney, and Mr. Rove in a rage. He says no to war, no to NAFTA, no to the WTO. He says yes to peace, yes to equality, and yes to Kyoto. Oh, Dennis, why can't you behave? You refuse to sell us down the river. You refuse to be a political slave. Oh, Dennis, why can't you behave? You're so stuck on truth in the voting booth, you think there was a country to save. Congressman Kucinich has been an unwavering champion of peace. He voted against the Patriot Act and the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. Part of his platform was the creation of a cabinet-level U.S. Department of Peace, currently House Resolution 1111, which would address violence at every level of society, domestic and international. In 2007, Dennis introduced articles of impeachment, charging Dick Cheney of misleading America into war. In 2008, he introduced an article to impeach George W. Bush for deceiving Congress with fabricated threats of Iraq weapons of mass destruction to fraudulently obtain support for an authorization of the use of military force against Iraq. Dennis is currently running for U.S. House of Representatives as an independent candidate. Please join me in welcoming Dennis Kucinich.
You have to unmute, Dennis.
We good? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Sharon, thank you. Thank you for that song. I've always been grateful for your support personally, and I'm grateful to all those who came together to make this invitation to speak about JFK's speech at American University. You know, first of all, as Sharon, when you said, every time you hear it, it's impactful. This is a speech that would be good for every American. It should be required watching for every American when they start high school, so they could begin to understand that war is not inevitable. I think it's important to look at the context from which John F. Kennedy spoke. As we know, he was in World War II, but he was part of a generation, his parents' generation, that was very familiar with World War I. When I was working on legislation to create a cabinet-level Department of Peace, I did some research and I saw that in the 20th century, over 100 million people perished in wars, most of them innocent civilians, 100 million people. Kennedy moved through that period of time, and his thinking was certainly shaped by that. You look at, in particular, as president, the Vietnam War, he at last made an attempt to take America in a different direction. The disaster of the Bay of Pigs, his total disgust with the CIA, and his understanding that there were elements of the government that were rogue, that he needed to try to control. When you look at how he, with the help of his brother Robert, addressed the challenge of missiles that Russia had put in Cuba, that Cuban Missile Crisis, which for some time in October of 1962 had the whole world on the edge with the possibility of a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Kennedy's speech at American University reflected an awareness of his personal experience as a young man at war, of his understanding of the dynamic of government, and his ability to try to take a new direction. His building a relationship with Khrushchev was absolutely critical, because had they not had a relationship, there would have been no communication. If there is no communication, we were certainly looking at a disaster in 1962. So his speech, some of the things that were noteworthy, and why I think this is one of the greatest presidential speeches of all time, and juxtapose it with where we are now. He said, we're not seeking a Pax Americana that's enforced by US weapons. Well, think about that. Right now, America is seeking a sort of Pax Americana, which is enforced by US weapons. We have over 800 bases around the world. We are using our weapons directly and indirectly to try to influence foreign policy around the world. Events in Ukraine and events in the Middle East are influenced heavily by the United States' overall foreign policy objectives, which remain opaque to most Americans. The fact that Kennedy addressed directly the dangers of nuclear fallout. You think about it, Jonathan Shell in the 80s, I think it was, wrote a book about nuclear winter. And we are still faced with that threat. And Russia today has more nuclear weapons than the United States. But we're the ones who are constantly rattling the saber of war. The point that, in paraphrasing Kennedy, he talked about, well, we're spending billions for weapons, which we, hope never to use. He brought up the economic issue repeatedly in this speech. And what I think was critical, where he spoke of our capacity for evolution, an evolution in our thinking, preceded by, of course, an evolution in consciousness, which this speech was an example of. His expression was he was an exponent of a new type of thinking in the government. When he talked about an evolution of thinking, he also talked about an evolution of institutions. Now, if any of you have ever visited the Jefferson Memorial and looked at the inscription encircled around the inside of the memorial, you'll see that Jefferson himself said that institutions must evolve with the mind of man. And so Kennedy seized on that rhythm and expressed the importance of institutional evolution. And thank you, Sharon, for mentioning the Department of Peace, because in my own experience, as a member of Congress, as I saw the readiness of my fellow colleagues to jump into conditions which would propel America towards war, I also understood the need for institutional expression of peace, which is the Department of Peace was all about. Again, building on Kennedy's thinking, war is not inevitable, peace is inevitable, and to have structures that help promote it domestically, teaching peace, even at an elementary level, peace-giving, peace-sharing, mutuality, looking at the other person as an aspect of oneself, and to realize the level of violence that exists in our own society. It's so critical that we look inward. Kennedy talked about that. It's important that we realize our own ability to be peacemakers here at home. That's where it starts. And the Department of Peace proposal, building on the idea of an institutional evolution, was and is still a choice to be able to look at how we address the issues of violence in our own society, of which war is a culmination of all violence. Domestic violence, spousal abuse, child abuse, violence in the schools, racial violence, violence against gays, police community clashes. These are all conditions which require us to look at our own capacity to evolve, to be more than we are and better than we are. And we can get there as a society. And Kennedy's speech here at American University helps to point the way. It was so important what he said about identifying with the aspirations of all nations. His speech was a unique identification in establishing mutuality with the citizens of Russia. He basically said, look, you might not like the government, maybe the people are okay. It's important. It made me think of of the words from Jan Sibelius, Finlandia. Sibelius wrote the music, and I think the words were written with the help of Lloyd Stone, or were created with Lloyd Stone years later. But listen to these words from Finlandia, because it reflects directly to Kennedy's speech about identifying with the people of all nations. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. But other hearts in other lands are beating, with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But other lands have sunlight too, and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, hear my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. Oh, hear my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine. Jan Sibelius, in 1899, did the music, and the lyrics were brought forward in this sense by Lloyd Stone in 1934. There is this consciousness that is imbued in Kennedy's speech, and it preceded that and follows it. And we understand that peace is something that begins with the way we think and being able to establish a connection of mutuality with others. Now, one of the things that, a number of things that Kennedy said, one of the things is he said that peace is rational. And again, we have to start examining our own attitudes, because as we think, so thinks the world. What's innermost becomes outermost. And he talked about looking inward, which goes back to, you can't have change unless we begin to shift the consciousness of the country. So in that way, a shift of consciousness, which especially opportunities like this where we talk about the speech, helps to challenge this notion about the inevitability of war. As Kennedy says, war is man-made, so too can peace be man-made. One of the things that I thought was noteworthy about this speech is the compassion that he demonstrated towards the Russian people. He talked about the way they suffered during World War II. The fact that, depending on who you talk to, anywhere from 20 to 30 million Russians perished in World War II. And I dare say that World War II could not have been concluded without Russia moving forward at great cost to their people. Kennedy stated, as we all know, again, talking about the human family, we live on the same planet. We breathe the same air. We cherish our children. and we're all mortal. And so he brings the practicality of peace forward, something that we need to keep in mind today, because today we're once again confronted with the impracticality of war. He talked about a new effort for world law. Where do we need that now? You know, right now, international law has been shredded. I barely say that international law exists only for those who are too weak to defend themselves against a military aggressor, which means you're on the wrong end. There is no such thing as international law if you look at events in the Middle East and the United States foreign affairs, which puts a prize of aggression over diplomacy, puts us in a position where we're forever at the threshold of a new war. The US's continual taunting of Russia together with NATO. I have to say that my heart breaks for the people of Ukraine who move towards freedom, and yet the US capsized their government and made an effort to use the people of Ukraine and the flower of their youth to displace Vladimir Putin in Russia, something that was for some in Ukraine, it might have been desirable, but the military price and the practicality of it was always in question. Ukraine has to be rebuilt, but it's the US that pushed the envelope and the Ukrainians paid the price when the war could have been settled a couple of years ago. Here again, we see an example in the belief of weapons and not a belief in the science of human relations. In the Middle East, again, we see a belief in weapons and a rewriting of the world's laws on genocide. It's hard to believe that for those who are aware of the sentiments that that have been expressed by John F. Kennedy in this singularly important speech, as a matter of not only a presidential expression, but as a matter of national policy that should still stand today. It's hard to believe anybody could be aware of that and just go, well, you know, that was yesterday. No, what Kennedy talked about are principles that are eternal, that we can learn to live with each other without and settle our difference peacefully. And that was and remains part of his legacy. So, you know, I think that we are in a period right now where the message of Kennedy and this speech becomes more important than ever. As he said, peace and freedom walk together. Peace and freedom go side by side. If you continually at war, you're going to lose your freedoms. And that's happening now in the United States. Our freedom of speech, our First Amendment rights are under attack because this country is escalating towards war. And he made a stand that is eternal, and that is peace as a human right. We have a right to be able to exist free of the fear of a war which would extinguish not only our lives, but extinguish all life on the planet. So it's a worthy endeavor for this group that's come together to be able to reflect on the imperative of John F. Kennedy's speech at American University so many years ago, and to realize that it is as relevant today, if not even more so, than it was when he delivered it. It was a visionary speech, and it should be a speech which embodies U.S. policy. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any of your questions. Thank you.